have a couple of updates in the Fables IP story. Bill Willingham, the creator of the Fables IP, the comic book series produced by DC Comics, and also the video game franchise published as The Wolf Among Us by Telltale Games, declared that the Fables IP is now completely in the public domain as a result of a contract dispute that he's having with DC. Willingham said that contractually, DC left ultimate ownership of the IP to him. DC fired back in a widely reported statement to Legacy Entertainment Media. The Fables comic book and graphic novels published by DC, and the storylines, characters, and elements therein are owned by DC and protected under the copyright laws of the United States and throughout the world in accordance with applicable law, and are not in the public domain. DC reserves all rights and will take such action as DC deems necessary or appropriate to protect its intellectual property rights. So obviously they mean to defend their territory pretty aggressively here. That's a problem if you wanted to write your own Fables content based on these characters. But let's take a step back here. The Fables universe is not based on original content. It's one giant derivative work based on centuries-old fairy tale characters. A derivative work is an artistic creation that includes copyrightable elements from an earlier original work, but which nevertheless transforms or modifies that work in some way that makes it independent from the original. That describes the Fables universe perfectly. Take the character of Snow White. She is what we would call a copyrightable element. If she had never existed in history, and you just made up a story about a beautiful girl as white as snow, with lips as red as blood, and hair as black as ebony, and whose superficial, insecure, and egotistical maniac of a stepmother wanted to murder her, well, yeah, you'd be able to copyright the characters, the story, everything. That's pretty original, right? But if there ever was a copyright on Snow White, or the Big Bad Wolf, they would have been held by the Brothers Grimm. If there was one on Cinderella or Yi Zhan in the original Chinese, it would be held by Duang Chengxi. It doesn't matter, because these characters have been in the public domain from time immemorial, yea, on to the Middle Ages. So you can't actually copyright a story about Snow White. Oh, you could rewrite the entire story, tell the entire thing in your own words, exactly the way it transpired in the original fairy tale, and you could copyright that, because it's your own words. You're adding your own creative content to the mix. Now, most of the stuff would not be copyrightable, though, because you could do that on Tuesday, and on Wednesday, I could write my own story about Snow White, and as long as I'm not copying your exact words, my story is just as original as yours is. Yeah, I can copyright it and sell it, and no one can just photocopy my stuff and sell it as their own, but that's pretty much about it. There's not much there, right? And after a certain point, you have to ask, is this even worth the effort? Should I try to just rewrite Snow White in my own words? Maybe I could take the Snow White character and do something a little bit different. So maybe I'll create a different story about Snow White, have her team up with the Big Bad Wolf to evict the three little pigs from their houses, tear down the houses, and then build a giant hotel and casino on the property called the Snow Wolf Towers. Well, that could be original, might be interesting. It's still a derivative work, but there's more unique content there. So I couldn't stop you at that point from writing your own word-for-word copy of the Snow White story original from the Brothers Grimm. But I could stop you from taking my idea and using that as some sort of bizarre allegory about the morality of ethics of capitalism in the real estate market today. That would be something that I could sue you over, because even though my work is derivative from the original, there still was cool original content, a secret sauce that I had going on that no one else had come up with and no one else had executed, and you were basically copying what I did there. And that brings us to Fables, because that is more or less what Bill Willingham did when he created Fables. It's one giant derivative work based on fairy tale characters, but it has a lot of unique copyrightable elements in the mix. Like, for example, Snow White's marriage and divorce from Prince Charming. Big Bad Wolf's face turn to be one of the good guys. The Snow White's revenge against the dwarves. Rose Red's betrayal of her sister. And the whole setting of these fairy tale characters trying to make a go of it in modern New York City. Those elements obviously weren't in the original, And so they're the copyrightable elements, the secret sauce of Bill Willingham's Fables universe. Now, going back to it, according to Bill, he owned all of those original parts of the derivative work. He says explicitly on his own Substack page that the Fables comic books were not what we call works made for hire. Okay, well, what are those? A work made for hire is just that. You're paid as an employee or a contractor to create something for somebody else. You don't own the work, you're paid a price, whatever you want for it, as long as it's agreeable. And once you're done, you take the money and you're done. That's it. It's the literal definition of selling out, kids. Oh, yeah, there may be nuances in the contract. Maybe you have the right to republish things under certain circumstances, etc. But generally, the person who paid the bill is going to own it, even if the creator was the one who literally invented everything himself. So if Bill's correct, operating under his theory, then he actually owned the unique elements of this derivative work called Fables, and when he released it, anyone can publish anything based on that in their own universe. But, and this is a real big but, DC doesn't agree with that theory. It says it owns all the comic books that it's been publishing since 2002. So it's kind of complicated. And the reality is, until someone sues someone else over this and actually goes to court and gets a decision, which actually hasn't happened yet, we won't know for sure, because we're not going to see the exact terms of the contract, we're not going to see supporting evidence and all that. So I don't want to leave you hanging, but that's kind of entering the realm of speculation, and I don't want to speculate too much and mislead people. So that said, is it worth the risk? Is technically correct the best kind of correct here somehow? Well, instead of trying to guess what's going on in the Fables universe, let's look at what happened in another famous example of a copyright of a famous character that had a lot of derivative work published around it. And that's the character of Sherlock Holmes. It turns out for the longest time, the famous British detective was the subject of copyright wrangling, and it illustrates how a copyright owner might use the legal system against a creator even when the copyright on the original source material had expired. Arthur Conan Doyle was a very prolific writer. He created Sherlock Holmes for a novella called A Study in Scarlet in 1887, and then he went on to write 4 novels and 58 short stories from that time until the last appearance of Sherlock Holmes in his short story The Adventure of Shoscombe Old Place in 1927. Arthur Conan Doyle died in 1931, but in the year 2020, his estate sued Netflix over a film adaptation they'd made of a character called Enola Holmes, Sherlock Holmes's niece. And it depicted Sherlock as a warmer, friendlier kind of father figure. Even though the copyright on A Study in Scarlet had long expired at that point. Because remember, even under modern American copyright law, a copyright only endures for the life of an author plus 70 years, which Conan Doyle died in 1931, 70 would have put him in 2001, right? But that's even assuming that those terms would have applied to his earlier work, which it wouldn't have. So anyway, the copyright on A Study in Scarlet was long gone, but the estate claimed that Doyle had changed the character of Sherlock Holmes over the years, especially after the death of Conan Doyle's son in World War I. And as a result, he started making Sherlock Holmes a more warmer, friendlier figure, one who liked dogs. And that was markedly different from the cold, calculating figure that he presented at the start of the series. In short, they argued that even though the original copyright from OG Sherlock had expired, this kinder, gentler Sherlock was a derivative work based on the author's own original work. And so the estate claimed that this kinder, gentler Sherlock, the one who loved dogs, was a new adaptation distinct from the original qualities and therefore a uniquely copyrightable element in a derivative work. Oh, by the way, the estate also named the woman who created Enola Holmes, Nancy Springer, the one who wrote the book series that the movies were based on in the lawsuit as well. So they were making a clean sweep. Now, as it turned out, the case was settled between Netflix and the Doyle estate for an undisclosed amount. But it's probably significant that Netflix didn't want to go to the mat on this one. These things are complicated, and they can be expensive. And even though nearly all the Sherlock Holmes works were in the public domain, the estate of Doyle hung its hat on that very last one written in 1927. And they tried to just push through this idea that the Sherlock works were, by the same author, were so significantly different that the elements of a nice, warm, friendly Sherlock were a separately copyrightable thing. So what does this mean for Fables? Can the author of fan fiction really have a shot of publishing his or her own stuff here? I mean, speaking personally, I would steer clear. But not necessarily for the reason you think. See, there's knowledge of legal theory, and then there's actual power. In my youth, I used to think knowledge was power. Now that I've grown up, I've learned that power is power. Companies like Disney, Marvel, and of course DC Comics have a lot of money. And therefore they have a lot of power when it comes to enforcing their intellectual property rights, especially against a lone creator. Even if you were 100% of the right, they could simply stall you with motion after motion, countersue with weak arguments, each of which you'd have to spend time and money defending until you're driven into bankruptcy, unless you happen to be worth billions on your own, or, popular enough that you can get somebody like Peter Thiel or Elon Musk to help fund your legal battles. So, here's what I would say. If you want to write a story about Snow White and the Big Bad Wolf, those characters are already in the public domain, but steer clear of making it in the Fables universe at the end of the day. But I have an even better question for you. Why would you want to do that in the first place? If you're already at the point where you're writing fan fiction, take the next step. Build your own universe. Don't tell yet another rehash of Snow White. That story's played out. Invent a new character. Invent a new setting. Have your protagonist grapple with some different problems. Here's the funny thing about all these stories that are timeless. They're timeless not because of how the characters looked. They're not timeless because of what they said. They're timeless because of the situations they faced. There are only so many different story tropes in human creativity up to this point. Take one of those basic concepts and do something different. Don't give us the 35th movie based on comic book characters that some writer came up with in the 1950s and 60s. Don't try to make Snow White and the Big Bad Wolf into something they're not. Don't imitate. Create. Be edgy. Do your own thing. Well, that's all I have to say about that. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe. If you didn't enjoy it, hey, give us a thumbs down. We got to get feedback somehow, right? See you later.